duty. So Kant would say that person B, their will is manifesting goodness. Person B has a good will because they're acting for the sake of duty. Without that motivation, without an action being motivated by duty, the action for Kant can't have moral worth. Even though the consequences are exactly the same, person A and person B, Kant would say the primary difference is the motivation, why they're doing what they're doing. Person B is doing the right thing because it's their duty, whereas person A, they're doing the honest policy simply out of their own self-interest. So the idea here that Kant is getting at is really one of motivation. Why do we do what we do? Is it simply because we're going to benefit from it? Or is it because it's the right thing to do in and of itself? In other words, we have a duty to act that way. Any action for Kant that's motivated by sympathy or even personal happiness, if I'm acting in a way because it brings me happiness, Kant would say that action doesn't have a proper motivation. It's not motivated by duty. Next, let's look at what he means by the categorical imperative. For Kant, the categorical imperative is the standard of all morality. We can think of this as Kant's fundamental principle of morality, or Kant's ethical test. Okay, so if you're following along in the text, I'm skipping ahead of duty. We're going to come back to that after we get done discussing the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is an unconditional, obligatory command that tells us what we should do. For Kant, it's unconditional in that it applies to all people at all times. So Kant has really given us here a universal moral theory. It's not a moral theory that he thinks only applies to certain people at a certain time. No, what he's really getting at here is a universal theory, a theory that's binding upon all rational agents, all rational beings. Kant thinks come under the authority and obligation of the categorical imperative. So it's going to tell us how we ought to act or what we should do. Okay, Kant distinguishes the categorical imperative from a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative simply says, if you want something, then you should act a certain way. For example, if you want to learn French, you should take a French class. The imperative in that case is hypothetical. It's saying, well, if you want to learn French, then you should do this. You should take the class. But the imperative is really, it's conditional. It's conditioned upon my wanting to learn French. If I don't want to learn French, then the imperative really doesn't apply to me. Okay, so there's a distinction between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative may or may not apply to you. But a categorical imperative, which is what we're concerned with here, Kant thinks does apply to all rational beings. Okay, so it takes the form of act thus, do this. The categorical imperative is very important in Kant's ethical theory, for it reveals our moral duty. So we see on the last slide that a good will is one which acts for the sake of duty. Well, the question would be, well, what are our duties as human beings? The categorical imperative will reveal to us those duties. It's going to reveal to us how we should act or what we should do as a human being, as a rational agent. Now, for Kant, he says that there's one categorical imperative. However, he gives several different formulations of that categorical imperative. So we'll look at a couple of those. I know there's one in the text, the most important one. All of them say essentially the same thing, all three formulations. But we should note that there's one imperative, and Kant formulates it in three different ways, and we'll take a look at some of those here as we go. Okay, so I have in italics there the quote from Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, where he says, "Act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature." This is the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Notice a couple of the words here that he uses. Act as if the maxim of your action. Okay, we're going to talk about what he means by a maxim. Were to become through your will a universal law of nature. If you watch the video that I posted for you from the Examine Life series, you know that Kant was a big fan of Isaac Newton. Kant was heavily influenced by Newtonian physics, and in many ways, Kant is trying to develop a philosophy for the moral sphere that resembles what Newton did in the physical sphere. Newton, as we know from science, formulated laws of gravity, laws of motion, etc. And these are universal laws of nature. They're natural laws that are binding upon all human beings or everything in the physical world. Kant is really trying to replicate Newton here. He wants to come up with universal laws of nature that govern all rational beings in the moral sphere. So if you're a rational agent, you should act this way, Kant thinks. And he's very confident in the powers of human reason to reveal to us these universal moral laws, such that he thinks that if we reason correctly, and if we think about it correctly, we should all come to these same basic decisions. I mean, we should all do the right thing if we're acting according to reason. Whether that's the case or not is a different story, but that's what Kant thinks. So act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. Okay, let's break this down here. I've broken it down into 4 different steps. And this is really the pattern you would go through in order to test if the maxim of your action could become a universal law of nature. So first of all, let's take up point number 1. Formulate a maxim that captures your reason for acting as you propose. What Kant means by a maxim is simply the guiding policy that describes what you're about to do. To give you the most famous example, one that Kant even gives, let's say that I'll kind of improvise it a little bit. Let's say that you're short on your rent. Say your rent is $700 a month and you only got $400. So you go to a friend and you ask the friend to loan you $300 to help you cover the rent. Your friend says, okay, I'll loan you the $300, provided that you pay me back in 2 weeks. Now, you full well know that you're not going to be able to pay your friend back in 2 weeks. However, you make the promise that you will pay him back in 2 weeks. So essentially what you've done is you've lied to your friend. You've promised to pay him back $300 in 2 weeks when you know there's no way you're going to come anywhere near $300 in the next couple weeks. if we were to formulate the maxim of that action, we could say something like, it is permissible to make a false promise when you are in a difficult situation, or when circumstances require it, it's permissible to make a false promise. Okay, that maxim there really describes what you're doing. It describes your personal policy, how you're about to act. You're saying it's okay